June 4, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110. This single document authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue $4.3 billion in silver certificates backed by physical silver, bypassing the Federal Reserve entirely. 5 months later, he was dead in Dallas. The world knows about Oswald, the grassy knoll, the magic bullet. What the world does not know is that Kennedy had declared war on the most powerful banking cartel in human history. And that war had rules. You do unthreaten the money supply and live to tell about it. The Federal Reserve isn't federal, and it has no reserves. It's a private banking consortium created in 1913 through political manipulation so brazen that its architect, Senator Nelson Aldrich, had to disguise the initial meeting as a duck hunting trip. By 1963, this institution controlled the entire U.S. money supply, collected interest on every dollar printed, and operated with zero government oversight. Kennedy was not the first president to challenge this system. Andrew Jackson survived an assassination attempt after destroying the second bank of the United States. And Abraham Lincoln printed greenbacks to bypass banker financing during the Civil War. But Kennedy was the first to challenge the Federal Reserve in the television age, when presidential power had reached its zenith and the world was watching. Here is what makes this story different from every conspiracy theory you've aired. The evidence is unhidden in classified documents or shadowy testimony. It's printed in the Federal Register, archived in Treasury Department records, and documented in the banking industry's own publications. Kennedy's Executive Order 11,110 wasn't a secret plot, it was public policy. The question isn't whether he challenged the Federal Reserve. The question is why everyone stopped talking about it the moment he died, and why his executive order was quietly rendered powerless without ever being officially repealed. This isn't a story about a lone gunman or a second shooter. This is a story about what happens when a president tries to return monetary sovereignty to the American people and discovers that sovereignty was sold to private bankers 50 years earlier. It's about the mathematical certainty of debt-based currency, the political impossibility of escape, and the brutal simplicity of what happens to leaders who forget that whoever controls the money supply controls everything else. The implications reach beyond Kennedy, beyond Dallas, beyond 1963, because the system that killed him is printing money right now. Okay? The debt is larger than ever, and not a single president since has dared to sign another order like 11,110. Welcome to the real story of November 22nd, 1963. The shots fired in Dealey Plaza ended a presidency. But the war Kennedy started against the Federal Reserve, that war ended before the shots were fired. Okay? He just didn't know it yet. November 22nd, 1910. 7 men boarded Senator Nelson Aldrich's private railway car at Hoboken Station in New Jersey, departing under cover of darkness for a destination none of them would publicly acknowledge. Their instructions were explicit. Use only first names. Avoid being seen together in public. Tell no one where they were going. These weren't criminals or conspirators in the traditional sense. They represented 1/4 of the world's total wealth. Nelson Aldrich, Senate Republican whip and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller. Jr., Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, America's largest bank. Henry Davison's senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, representing J.P. Morgan. Paul Warburg, partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company and representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty. A Pyatt, Andrew assistant, secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Their destination was Jekyll Island, Georgia, private hunting club owned by the wealthiest families in America. For 10 days, they worked in complete secrecy, drafting legislation that would fundamentally restructure American finance. What emerged from Jekyll Island wasn't called the Federal Reserve Act. It was called the Aldrich Plan. And when news leaked about its origins, public outrage killed it instantly. Americans in 1910 remembered the panic of 1907, when J.P. Morgan had single-handedly prevented economic collapse by coordinating private bank rescues from his library. They understood, viscerally, what it meant when bankers had more power than government. So the conspirators adapted. They waited for the 1912 election, which brought Democrat Woodrow Wilson to power and shifted Congress to Democratic control. The Aldrich Plan was repackaged as the Federal Reserve Act, now supposedly designed to rein in banker power rather than consolidate it. The changes were cosmetic, the core mechanism remained identical. Warburg, the intellectual architect, explained the strategy in his private papers. The matter of a bill must be so handled that both parties will turn their backs on it. Get it mixed up with politics, and only when it is an accomplished fact will the people realize what has happened. The bill passed the House on December 22, 1913, by a vote of 298-260. Most congressmen had left Washington for Christmas. Those remaining hadn't read the 1,750-page document. The Senate passed it the next day, 43-25. President Wilson signed it into law on December 23, 1913. Years later, Wilson would write, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. Industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, in all our activities are in the hands of a few men." What Wilson signed wasn't a government agency. The Federal Reserve System consisted of 12 regional banks, each privately owned by member banks in their districts. These member banks purchased stock in the Federal Reserve banks, received dividends on that stock, and elected the majority of directors who controlled Fed policy. The Board of Governors in Washington provided a fig leaf of government oversight, but the real power resided in the New York Federal Reserve Bank, controlled by the same banking families who met at Jekyll Island. The mechanism was elegantly simple. The U.S. government would borrow money from the Federal Reserve by issuing bonds. The Fed would purchase these bonds by creating money from nothing, literally typing numbers into existence. The government would pay interest on this borrowed money. That interest would flow to the private banks that owned the Federal Reserve. Before 1913, the U.S. Treasury printed money directly, backed by gold or silver. Citizens could exchange paper currency for precious metals at any time. This limited how much money government could create, preventing inflation and maintaining purchasing power. After 1913, money became debt. Every dollar in circulation represented a dollar borrowed plus interest owed. The money to pay the interest didn't exist, had to be borrowed as well, creating an infinite cycle of expanding debt. This wasn't a flaw in the design. This was the design. The Federal Reserve's first major test came with World War I. The U.S. entered the war in 1917, requiring massive financing. Instead of raising taxes or selling bonds directly to citizens, Lincoln's greenback solution: the government borrowed from the Federal Reserve. The national debt exploded from $1 billion in 1913 to $25 billion in 1919. Every penny of that $24 billion increase came with interest owed to private banks. The bankers who created the Fed had financed both sides of the conflict. American loans to the Allies were underwritten by J.P. Morgan and Company, while German war bonds were managed by Warburg's family bank in Hamburg. Profit regardless of outcome. The mathematically perfect business model. By 1920, the Federal Reserve held more power over American economic life than any institution in U.S. history. It could expand or contract the money supply at will, causing boom or bust cycles. It could raise interest rates to crush competition or lower them to fuel speculation. It operated without congressional oversight, published no detailed financial statements, and answered to no public authority. The bankers who met in secret at Jekyll Island had achieved something unprecedented. They had privatized the money supply of the world's rising superpower and made themselves indispensable to its operation. This was the machine that would be humming along, unchallenged and immensely profitable, until a young president from Massachusetts decided that Article 1 Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress alone the power to coin money and regulate its value, actually meant something. To understand what Kennedy threatened, you need to understand how American currency actually worked in 1963. Walk into any bank that year, and you'd see two types of dollar bills in circulation. The first and most common were Federal Reserve notes printed by the Bureau of Engraving but issued by the Federal Reserve System. These notes were debt instruments. Each one represented money borrowed into existence, backed by government bonds held by the Fed. The second type, increasingly rare, were United States notes and silver certificates printed and issued directly by the U.S. Treasury. These were direct obligations of the United States government, backed by silver stored in Treasury vaults. The distinction seems technical, but it was everything. When government needed money under the Federal Reserve System, it worked like this. The Treasury printed bonds promises to repay with interest. The Federal Reserve purchased these bonds by creating money electronically. This new money was deposited in the Treasury's account. The government spent this money. The taxpayers paid interest on it forever. The Federal Reserve collected that interest and distributed it to member banks as dividends. Under the silver certificate system, the process was different. The Treasury printed certificates. Certificates represented actual silver stored in government vaults. The government spent the certificates directly. No bonds were issued, accumulated. No private banks collected profit. The money supply expanded, but the debt didn't. Here's the staggering part. In 1963, the U.S. government held $1.87 billion in silver bullion in Treasury vaults. Under existing law, this silver backed only a small portion of circulating currency. Kennedy recognized the mathematical absurdity. Government was paying interest to borrow money when it possessed the constitutional authority and physical assets to issue money directly. The silver sitting in Treasury vaults could back $4.3 billion in certificates, placing $4.3 billion in Federal Reserve notes and eliminating the interest payments on that portion of the debt. Executive Order 11,110, signed on June 4, 1963, did exactly this. It amended Executive Order 10,289 to give the Treasury Secretary the authority to issue silver certificates against silver bullion, silver or standard silver dollars held by the Treasury. The order was implemented immediately. On the same day Kennedy signed it, the Treasury announced plans to issue $4.3 billion in silver certificates in denominations of $2, $5, $10, and $20. These new certificates were printed with red seals instead of the green seals on Federal Reserve notes, making the distinction visible to every American who handled them. The first $2 United States notes entered circulation in August 1963. They carried the inscription United States Note instead of Federal Reserve Note and featured Kennedy's signature as printed under the Treasury Secretary's authorization. More importantly, they carried no interest obligation. They were money, not debt. By October 1963, $421 million in United States notes circulated alongside Federal Reserve notes. The Treasury had concrete plans to issue the remaining $3.9 billion by 1964. The implications were nuclear. The Federal Reserve's entire business model depended on government borrowing. In 1963, the national debt stood at $305 billion, generating approximately $9 billion annually in interest payments. Most of this interest flowed to the Federal Reserve and its member banks. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened to eliminate not just the dollar, $4.3 billion in direct issuance, but the precedent itself. If government could issue $4.3 billion without borrowing, why not $43 billion? Why not eliminate the Federal Reserve entirely and return to constitutional money as Lincoln had done with greenbacks? The banking establishment understood the threat immediately. The American Bankers Association published a cryptic warning in its monthly bulletin. The issuance of United States notes represents a fundamental challenge to sound monetary policy. Such issuance creates inflation risk and undermines confidence in the dollar's stability. Translation: if government can print money without borrowing from us, we lose control of the money supply and the profit it generates. But Kennedy had done his homework. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had been chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission and understood bank manipulation intimately. JFK himself had studied economics at Harvard under professors who questioned the Federal Reserve's monopoly. His Harvard thesis was published as Why England Slept, analyzed how financial interests had shaped British appeasement policy in the 1930s. Kennedy understood that banking interests shaped policy more than voters did. More critically, Kennedy had the political capital to challenge the system. He'd won the presidency with the largest electoral college margin in 16 years. His approval rating in mid-1963 hovered at 59%, solid, if not spectacular. He controlled both houses of Congress. He defaced down Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis and emerged as the leader of the free world. He was untouchable allure, so he thought. The silver certificate program had one vulnerability: silver prices. The certificates were redeemable for physical silver at $1.29 per ounce. If market prices exceeded this redemption price, citizens could exchange certificates for silver, melt the silver, and sell it at market rates for a profit. This would drain Treasury silver reserves and collapse the certificate program. Kennedy's team calculated that silver prices would remain stable because industrial demand had plateaued and government reserves were adequate. This calculation assumed normal market conditions. It didn't account for what happens when the world's largest banks decide to destroy a currency system by manipulating commodity prices. By November 1963, silver prices had remained stable for months. The certificate program was succeeding beyond projections. Treasury officials were quietly drafting plans to expand issuance to $10 billion by 1965. Kennedy mentioned the silver certificates in private conversations with advisors, describing them as the first step toward breaking the money monopoly. He told his Treasury Secretary, C. Douglas Dillon, that once the certificates proved stable, he intended to explore issuing Treasury notes backed by gold reserves, further reducing dependence on Federal Reserve borrowing. The Federal Reserve Board, meeting in closed session on November 12, 1963, discussed the certificate program for 3 hours. No minutes from this meeting were ever published. We know it occurred because one attendee, board member J. Dewey Don, mentioned it in a 1974 oral history interview, stating only that serious concerns were raised about recent Treasury initiatives that might undermine monetary stability. 10 days later, Kennedy was dead. Kennedy wasn't the first president to wage war against private banking control. He wasn't even the first to survive an assassination attempt because of it. That distinction belongs to Andrew Jackson, who fought the Second Bank of the United States with such ferocity that his gravestone epitaph reads simply, "I killed the bank." The Second Bank was chartered in 1816, operated as America's proto-federal reserve. It was a private corporation with a 20-year charter to serve as the federal government's banker. The bank held government deposits, issued currency, and controlled credit availability nationwide. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, wielded more economic power than any elected official. In 1832, Jackson vetoed the bank's charter renewal, declaring, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. When the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain." Biddle responded by deliberately contracting credit, triggering a recession to prove the economy needed the bank. Jackson's response was more direct. He removed all federal deposits from the Second Bank and distributed them among state banks. Biddle's weapon was neutralized. The bank's charter expired in 1836. Biddle himself was later arrested for fraud. But on January 30th, 1835, as Jackson left the Capitol building, An assassin named Richard Lawrence fired 2 pistols at point-blank range. Both misfired, a statistical impossibility, 1/925,000 chance. Jackson survived and beat Lawrence with his cane. Lawrence was ruled insane and institutionalized. K told doctors he'd been paid by Whig bankers who promised his debts would be forgiven if Jackson died. No investigation followed. Case was closed. Abraham Lincoln faced the same choice during the Civil War: borrow from banks at crippling interest rates or print money directly. He chose the latter. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the Treasury to print $150 million in United States notes, printed with green ink on the back and forever known as greenbacks. These notes carried no interest, required no debt, and were backed by government authority alone. Lincoln issued $450 million in greenbacks during the war, financing Union victory without creating permanent debt bondage to European banks. The banking establishment was apoplectic. The London Times published an editorial in 1865 stating, "If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic, should become permanent, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will become prosperous beyond precedent. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." Lincoln was assassinated 6 weeks later. His successor, Andrew Johnson, immediately moved to retire the greenbacks and return to bank-issued currency. By 1866, Congress passed the Contraction Act, systematically removing greenbacks from circulation. The money supply contracted by 31% over the next 7 years, causing deflation, depression, and massive wealth transfer from debtors to creditors. The banks won. James Garfield, inaugurated in 1881, publicly stated, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." He was shot 4 months into his presidency. William McKinley, who supported bimetallism backing currency with both gold and silver to expand money supply beyond banker control, was assassinated in 1901. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, abandoned bimetallism immediately and supported the banking interests that would create the Federal Reserve 12 years later. By 1963, this history was forgotten, buried in economics textbooks, and dismissed as coincidence. Kennedy knew it. His personal library included a monetary history of the United States by Milton Friedman and Creature from Jekyll Island, an expose of the Federal Reserve's creation. Kennedy discussed monetary policy with advisors who remembered the Depression and understood how banking manipulation had caused it. The Federal Reserve had contracted the money supply by 33% between 1929 and 1933, turning a stock market crash into economic catastrophe. 10,000 banks failed, millions starved. All because the private banking cartel that controlled money decided contractions served their interests. Kennedy studied what happened to leaders who challenged this system. He knew about Jackson's survival and Lincoln's murder. He believed the difference was Power Jackson had been a military hero with fanatical public support. Lincoln had been in the middle of a civil war. Kennedy had Camelot, the nuclear codes, and enough Secret Service protection to feel invulnerable. He calculated that in the television age, with the world watching, the banking cartel couldn't touch an American president without destroying their own legitimacy. This calculation overlooked one crucial factor. The Federal Reserve didn't need to act openly. They had built, over 50 years, a system where money itself was the weapon, and economic manipulation was untraceable to specific actors. They had cultivated relationships with intelligence agencies born from Wall Street recruitment, talent Dulles. The CIA director Kennedy, fired after the Bay of Pigs, had been a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, legal counsel to multiple Federal Reserve member banks. They had funded think tanks, universities, media outlets, all teaching the gospel that central banking was scientific necessity, not private profit scheme. Most importantly, they had the patience that comes from controlling a system designed to last forever. Kennedy was temporary. The Federal Reserve was permanent. If he pushed too hard, he could be removed. If he died, his policies would die with him. The silver certificates would be quietly retired. The national debt would resume its exponential growth. The interest payments would flow, and no president would dare challenge the system again. By late October 1963, Kennedy had made his position clear. In a speech to Columbia University students on November 12, 1963, 10 days before Dallas, he stated, "The high office of the president has been used to foment a plot to destroy American freedom. And before I leave office, I must inform the citizens of their plight." The speech was not about the Federal Reserve explicitly, but those who understood monetary policy heard the message. Kennedy had declared war on the money monopoly, and he wasn't backing down. History suggests this was a fatal miscalculation. To understand why Kennedy's challenge was so threatening, you need to understand exactly how the Federal Reserve controls the American economy. This isn't complicated banking theory. This is the actual mechanism, step by step, of how private banks manipulate the entire economic system for profit. The Federal Reserve doesn't print money in the traditional sense. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing physically manufactures currency, but that's irrelevant to how the money supply actually expands. 97% of US money exists only as digital entries in bank computers. Here, how it is created. A person walks into Bank A and asks for a $100,000 mortgage. Bank A doesn't lend out deposit or savings. Instead, Bank A creates $100,000 from nothing, literally typing numbers into a computer-ran credits the borrower's account. The borrower now owes bank 100,000 Australian dollars plus interest. But here's where it gets interesting. That $100,000 doesn't stop there. The person who sold the house deposits $100,000 into Bank B under fractional reserve banking rules. Bank B must keep only 10%, $10,000 in reserve. The other $90,000 can be lent out, created from nothing as another loan. That $90,000 gets deposited in Bank C, which lends out $81,000, then $72,900, then $65,610. The original $100,000 loan generates $1 million in total money supply through this multiplier effect. Every dollar of that $1 million is someone's debt owed to a bank with interest. The money to pay the interest doesn't exist. It must be borrowed into existence through the same process, generating more debt. This is mathematically unsustainable. Total debt must grow exponentially forever, or the system collapses. This isn't a flaw. This is how debt-based currency functions. The Federal Reserve controls this system through three mechanisms. First, the discount rate interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow from the Fed. Lower this rate, and banks borrow more, creating more loans, expanding money supply. Raise it, and lending contracts. Money supply shrinks. Second, reserve requirements. The percentage banks must hold in reserve. Lower requirements mean more lending and money creation. Higher requirements restrict it. Third, open market operations. The Fed buying or selling government bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, it pays by creating new money, injecting liquidity into banks. When it sells bonds, it pulls money out of circulation. These three tools give the Federal Reserve dictatorial control over economic cycles. Want to create a boom? To lower rates? Reduce reserves? Buy bonds. Want to cause a crash? Raise rates, increase reserves, sell bonds. The 2008 financial crisis provides a perfect example. From 2000 to 2006, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan kept interest rates at historic lows, dropping to 1% in 2003. This flooded the economy with cheap credit, fueling the housing bubble. Banks created mortgage-backed securities, sold them globally, and collected fees at every step. When housing prices peaked in 2006, the Fed raised rates. Suddenly, borrowers with adjustable rate mortgages couldn't afford payments. Defaults cascaded. Banks holding mortgage-backed securities faced insolvency. The system teetered toward collapse. The Federal Reserve's response: create $4.5 trillion from nothing through quantitative easing, buying bonds and toxic assets from failing banks at face value. This wasn't taxpayer money. This was money typed into existence, given to the exact institutions whose recklessness caused the crisis. The banks survived. Shareholders maintained value. Executives kept their bonuses. Millions of Americans lost homes, jobs, life savings. The national debt exploded from $9 trillion in 2008 to $14 trillion by 2011. Every penny of that new debt generates interest payments flowing to Federal Reserve member banks. This is the system Kennedy threatened with his silver certificates. The Treasury could issue $4.3 billion without borrowing. The mathematical model breaks. Government spending no longer automatically increases the national debt. The money supply can expand without private banks creating it through loans. The interest payments that fund the entire system disappear. The Federal Reserve becomes unnecessary. The banking establishment's response to such threats follows a predictable pattern. First, economic pressure manipulates markets to make alternative currencies unstable. Second, political pressure lobbying campaign contributions. Think tank propaganda claiming the alternative will cause hyperinflation or economic collapse. Third, if economic and political pressure fail, more direct action. History is clear. Leaders who seriously threaten monetary control don't last. In 1963, the Federal Reserve could unopenly destroy Kennedy's silver certificates through economic manipulation. Yet, they'd only been in circulation for 3 months. The program was succeeding. Political pressure had failed. Kennedy ignored banking industry lobbying. That left one option, and history suggests the banking establishment wasn't afraid to use it. Consider the cast of characters around Kennedy's assassination. Allen Dulles, fired as CIA director by Kennedy, had deep Wall Street connections and served on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. John McCloy, former president of the World Bank and board member of multiple Federal Reserve banks, also served on the Warren Commission. Both men had spent careers protecting banking interests. Both men concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Both men ensured no investigation examined Kennedy's monetary policy as potential motive. The mechanism of control operates on multiple levels simultaneously: financial control through debt, political control through lobbying, media control through ownership and advertising, academic control through funding and grants, intelligence control through recruitment and shared interests. When a president threatens this system, every level activates. Kennedy didn't face a single enemy. He faced an interlocking directorate of banks, corporations, intelligence agencies, and media outlets, all of which benefited from debt-based currency, and all of which had the means and motive to eliminate the threat. By November 1963, Kennedy had signed the Silver Certificate Order, publicly criticized the Federal Reserve System, and privately discussed plans to expand Treasury issuance. He had 5 more years in office, if re-elected, more than enough time to fundamentally restructure American monetary policy. The banking establishment faced an existential threat from a popular president with the constitutional authority to destroy their monopoly. The mathematics were simple: eliminate Kennedy, or watch 50 years of carefully constructed control mechanisms dismantled by a man who actually read the Constitution and believed it meant what it said. October 1962. Soviet ships carrying nuclear missiles approached Cuba while American destroyers formed a blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath, certain that nuclear war was imminent. What history remembers is Kennedy's resolve, Khrushchev's retreat, and the hotline established to prevent future crises. What history forgets is the financial dimension. How Kennedy's handling of the crisis terrified the banking establishment and set the stage for everything that followed. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a Cold War confrontation. It was Kennedy's Declaration of Independence from the national security establishment that had guided American foreign policy since World War II. This establishment, the CIA, Pentagon, defense contractors, and the banks financing them operated on a simple principle. Perpetual tension with the Soviet Union justified unlimited military spending, which generated unlimited profits, and unlimited debt, which generated unlimited interest payments to the Federal Reserve System. Kennedy undermined this entire model by negotiating directly with Khrushchev and choosing peace over escalation. When the crisis ended, Kennedy authorized secret negotiations with the Soviets on comprehensive arms limitations. He delivered his famous peace speech at American University in June 1963, calling for an end to the Cold War. He signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in August 1963. Most dangerously, he issued National Security Action Memorandum 263 in October 1963, ordering the withdrawal of 1,000 military advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963 and full withdrawal by 1965. This threatened a financial empire built on war. By 1963, defense spending consumed $53 billion annually, 17% of the federal budget and 9% of GDP. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and General Dynamics derived 70 to 90% of revenue from military contracts. Banks financed these contracts through government bonds, collecting interest on every dollar spent on weapons, bases, and soldiers. A peace dividend reducing military spending and redirecting resources to domestic programs would eliminate billions in defense contracts and the debt financing them. The banking dimension was explicit. In 1963, defense spending was financed entirely through deficit spending. Government borrowed money from the Federal Reserve to pay defense contractors. This borrowing generated $9 billion annually in interest payments. Kennedy's peace initiatives threatened to reduce defense spending by $20 to $30 billion annually, eliminating the interest payments on that borrowing, combined with his silver certificates, eliminating interest on an additional $4.3 billion. Kennedy's policies threatened to cut Federal Reserve profits by 30 to 40% over 5 years. The same banking families that controlled the Federal Reserve controlled defense contractors, TIA, through interlocking directorates. David Rockefeller served on the board of Boeing while running Chase Manhattan Bank, the largest Federal Reserve member bank. John McCloy, former World Bank president, served on the board of United Fruit Company while advising multiple weapons manufacturers. Allen Dulles had been both CIA director and board member of United Fruit, which had lobbied for the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion after Castro nationalized its Cuban plantations. These men saw Kennedy's peace initiatives as existential threats. War generated debt. Debt generated interest. Interest generated wealth and power. Peace threatened all of it. When Kennedy fired Dulles after the Bay of Pigs disaster, he was unjust firing an incompetent CIA director. He was declaring war on the military banking complex that had shaped American foreign policy for 20 years. The Cuban Missile Crisis crystallized the conflict. Kennedy's military advisors, led by Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, urged immediate airstrikes on Cuban missile sites, followed by full invasion. This would have triggered Soviet retaliation, likely leading to nuclear war. Kennedy refused. He chose naval blockade and negotiation. When the crisis resolved peacefully, LeMay told Kennedy to his face, "This is the greatest defeat in our history." Kennedy responded, "We had a chance of killing 80 million people in 72 hours. Called this a victory." LeMay wasn't alone in his fury. Military contractors had geared up for massive weapons production. Banks had arranged financing for expansion. The Pentagon had prepared operational budgets assuming war. Kennedy's peaceful resolution left them holding unused capacity and unfulfilled contracts. The immediate financial impact was minimal, but the precedent was catastrophic. If presidents could resolve crises through diplomacy rather than force, the entire profit model collapsed. Kennedy understood this. In private conversations, he described the military-industrial complex as conspiracy so immense that it controlled government policy, regardless of which party held power. He told aide Kenny O'Donnell, "I am going to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." He told Senator Mike Mansfield that after re-election in 1964, he would pull out of Vietnam completely. He told his brother Robert that these people are crazy, in reference to Pentagon generals pushing for preemptive nuclear strikes. What Kennedy didn't fully grasp was how completely banking interests had penetrated national security apparatus. The CIA recruited heavily from Wall Street. Most operatives came from banking families or Ivy League institutions funded by banking endowments. Pentagon's budget planning involved direct consultation with Federal Reserve economists. Defense contractors maintained executives who rotated between corporate boards and government positions. The system was designed to ensure that war remained profitable and peace remained impossible. By late 1963, Kennedy had committed multiple capital offenses against this system. He'd chosen peace over war. He'd fired the CIA director. He'd ordered Vietnam withdrawal. He'd challenged the Federal Reserve with silver certificates. He'd proposed cuts to defense spending. He'd negotiated directly with the Soviets without consulting national security advisors. Any single action might have been forgiven. All of them together created an unbearable threat. The final insult came in November 1963, when Kennedy approved plans to normalize relations with Cuba, potentially ending the embargo and allowing American banks to lose the justification for opposing Castro. This would have eliminated the last major flashpoint, justifying Caribbean military presence and defense spending. For the banking establishment, Kennedy had become impossible to control through normal political pressure. He was too popular, too confident, too committed to peace and monetary reform. Historical precedent suggested a solution. Presidents who challenged banking interests faced assassination. Presidents who pursued peace over war faced removal. Kennedy was doing both. The mathematics were simple. Eliminate Kennedy before he could dismantle the war economy and monetary monopoly, or watch 50 years of carefully constructed profit mechanisms destroyed by a man who actually believed presidents served the people rather than the banks. On November 22, 1963, the problem solved itself. The motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza at 12:29 p.m. Central Time. Kennedy sat in the back of the convertible Lincoln Continental. Jackie beside him, Governor John Connally in the front. The crowd cheered. Kennedy waved. At 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out. Kennedy slumped forward, then jerked backward. His head exploded in a mist of blood and brain matter. Jackie crawled onto the trunk of the car, reaching for pieces of her husband's skull. Secret Service agent Clint Hill shoved her back inside. The driver accelerated toward Parkland Hospital. At 1 p.m., doctors pronounced John Fitzgerald Kennedy dead. He was 46 years old. Within 2 hours, Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald for shooting Officer J.D. Tippit. Later that evening, they charged him with assassinating the president. Oswald claimed he was just a patsy. On November 24th, while being transferred from city jail to county jail, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot Oswald in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters on live television. Oswald died 2 hours later. The only person directly accused of killing Kennedy was now dead, unable to testify, unable to implicate others, unable to explain anything. The investigation began immediately, but with peculiar constraints. On November 29th, President Lyndon Johnson established a Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. Johnson personally selected the 7 members, including Allen Dulles, the CIA director Kennedy had fired, and John McCloy, former World Bank president with deep Federal Reserve connections. The commission's conclusion was predetermined. Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, no additional shooters. Case closed. The evidence told a different story. Multiple witnesses reported shots from the grassy knoll, not the Texas School Book Depository where Oswald supposedly fired from. The Zapruder film showed Kennedy's head snapping backward, consistent with a shot from the front, not behind. Parkland Hospital doctors described a massive exit wound in the back of Kennedy's head, impossible if shot from behind. The magic bullet supposedly passed through Kennedy's neck, Connolly's torso, Connolly's wrist, and Connolly's thigh, emerging in pristine condition. This defied physics and common sense. The Warren Commission dismissed all contradictory evidence. They ignored witnesses who contradicted the official narrative. They sealed critical documents for 75 years until 2038. They conducted zero investigation into Kennedy's monetary policy as potential motive. The final report, published in September 1964, ran 888 pages and concluded that Oswald, a mentally unstable communist sympathizer, acted alone for no clear reason. The commission never asked why Oswald had been on the FBI's watch list since 1959, why he'd been allowed to return from the Soviet Union without prosecution, or why he'd been working in a building directly along the motorcade route. More suspicious was what happened immediately after Kennedy's death. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in at 2:38 p.m. aboard Air Force One, still parked at Dallas Love Field. His first action as president was to seal Kennedy's body in a casket and fly it to Washington before Texas authorities could perform the legally required autopsy. The military autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital was conducted by pathologists with no experience in gunshot wounds. Photographs were classified. Kennedy's brain disappeared entirely from the National Archives. Critical evidence was destroyed or hidden before independent examination became possible. Within hours of Kennedy's death, the narrative was established. Lone gunman, no conspiracy, case closed. This narrative was pushed by media outlets before investigation even began. The CIA had assets in every major newspaper, later revealed through Operation Mockingbird. These assets shaped coverage to prevent speculation about conspiracy. Anyone questioning the official story was labeled a crackpot conspiracy theorist. The ridicule was systematic and effective. But here's what makes the timing impossible to ignore. On the day Kennedy died, he'd been scheduled to deliver a speech in Dallas about dark forces threatening American freedom. The speech was never delivered. Its text disappeared from archives. Kennedy's secretary later confirmed the speech referenced banking interests and monetary policy, but the only copy was in Kennedy's briefcase, which vanished after the assassination. Within days of Kennedy's death, specific policy reversals began. Johnson's first major action was National Security Action Memorandum 273, issued on November 26, 1963, 4 days after the assassination. This memorandum reversed Kennedy's NSAM 263, canceling the Vietnam withdrawal and authorizing expanded military operations. The war escalated. By 1968, 536,000 American troops were in Vietnam. Defense spending exploded. Banks financed it all. The interest payments grew exponentially. On silver certificates, the reversal was quieter but equally decisive. Johnson never formally repealed Executive Order 11,110. Instead, the Treasury simply stopped issuing new silver certificates. The $4.3 billion authorization remained on paper, but no additional notes entered circulation. The Federal Reserve resumed its monopoly on money creation. By 1968, all remaining silver certificates were removed from circulation and exchanged for Federal Reserve notes. Kennedy's direct challenge to debt-based currency disappeared as though it never existed. The man who signed these reversals, Lyndon Johnson, had a peculiar financial history. His personal wealth grew from $100,000 in 1948 to $14 million by 1964. Despite a congressional salary of $12,500 annually. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, had acquired television and radio station licenses under suspicious circumstances, creating a media empire in Texas. Banking families had financed Johnson's campaigns since the 1940s. He owed them everything. Johnson's relationship with the Federal Reserve was the opposite of Kennedy's. Where Kennedy challenged the system, Johnson embraced it. Where Kennedy sought to reduce debt, Johnson expanded it massively through the Great Society programs and Vietnam War, both financed through Federal Reserve borrowing. By 1968, the national debt had grown from $305 billion to $347 billion. Interest payments on that debt exceeded $12 billion annually. The Federal Reserve member banks collected every penny. One person understood what happened better than anyone else. Abraham Bolden was the first black Secret Service agent, personally selected by Kennedy to serve on the White House detail. In late October 1963, Bolden was investigating threats against Kennedy in Chicago and uncovered evidence of a conspiracy involving Cuban exiles, mob figures, and CIA operatives. He reported this to his superiors. He was immediately transferred away from the presidential detail. He tried to testify before the Warren Commission about the threats he'd uncovered. He was arrested on fabricated counterfeiting charges, convicted by an all-white jury, and imprisoned for 6 years. The message was clear. Speak about Kennedy's assassination, face destruction. The pattern repeated with other witnesses. Lee Bowers, who debanned in a railroad tower overlooking Dealey Plaza and reported seeing suspicious activity behind the grassy knoll, died in a car accident in 1966. Dorothy Kilgallen was a journalist who interviewed Jack Ruby and claimed to have information that would break the case wide open, died under mysterious circumstances in 1965. David Ferry, pilot connected to anti-Castro operations who'd been under investigation by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, died of a cerebral hemorrhage before he could testify. The list of mysterious deaths connected to Kennedy's assassination witnesses eventually numbered over 50. November 22, 1963, didn't just end Kennedy's presidency. It ended the last serious attempt by an American president to challenge Federal Reserve control of the money supply. Every president since has accepted the system. Nixon ended gold backing in 1971, completing the transition to pure fiat currency. Reagan exploded the deficit through military spending. Bush Sr. promised no new taxes, but raised them anyway to service debt. Clinton balanced the budget briefly, then repealed Glass-Steagall, allowing banks to consolidate further. Bush Jr. created unfunded wars and Medicare expansion, adding trillions to debt. Obama bailed out banks with trillions in quantitative easing. Trump added $8 trillion in 4 years. Biden continued the pattern. Not one of them has signed an executive order remotely similar to Kennedy's 11,110. Not one has seriously questioned why a private banking cartel controls America's money supply. Not one has suggested returning to constitutional currency backed by precious metals or issued directly by the Treasury. They learned the lesson Dallas taught: challenge the Fed, die in office. Accept the system, finish your term. The Warren Commission wasn't created to find truth. It was created to prevent it. Chief Justice Earl Warren himself told Staff Attorney Burt Griffin, "The findings have been predetermined. Your job is to make the evidence fit the conclusion." That conclusion Oswald acted alone was decided before investigation began, and every piece of contradictory evidence was systematically suppressed, ignored, or destroyed. Start with the commission's composition. Lyndon Johnson personally selected 7 members, ensuring none would probe too deeply. Allen Dulles, fired by Kennedy, had obvious motive to protect CIA involvement. John McCloy, former World Bank president, had spent his career protecting banking interests. Senator Richard Russell, a Georgia Democrat, was a longtime Johnson ally. Representative Gerald Ford, a Michigan Republican, was an FBI informant who passed commission information to J. Edgar Hoover. Representative Hale Boggs later recanted his support for the commission findings, claiming he'd been pressured to sign. Senator John Sherman Cooper, the lone skeptic, was outvoted on every major question. The commission operated under impossible constraints from the start. They had 9 months to investigate the most important murder in American history. They conducted no independent forensic analysis. They relied entirely on FBI reports, despite Hoover's obvious conflicts of interest. They interviewed 552 witnesses, but called only 94 to testify publicly. They sealed 75% of documents for 75 years, till 2038. They claimed national security justified secrecy, but the truth was simpler. The evidence contradicted their predetermined conclusion. Consider the medical evidence. Parkland Hospital doctors in Dallas described Kennedy's wounds in detail. Dr. Malcolm Perry stated that the throat wound was an entrance wound, indicating a shot from the front. Dr. Robert McClelland described a massive exit wound in the right rear of Kennedy's skull, again indicating a frontal shot. Multiple doctors signed statements confirming this. The Zapruder film, showing Kennedy's head snapping backward, corroborated their observations. The military autopsy at Bethesda contradicted everything. A capologist, none experienced in gunshot wounds, claimed all shots came from behind. They claimed the throat wound was an exit wound, not entrance. They claimed the head wound demonstrated rear entry. Their photographs showed different injuries than Dallas doctors described. Kennedy's brain, which would have provided definitive evidence, disappeared from the National Archives. The original autopsy photographs were classified. The X-rays showed evidence of alteration. The entire autopsy violated standard medical procedures. The Warren Commission accepted the Bethesda autopsy and dismissed Dallas doctors' testimony. And Commission lawyer Arlen Specter proposed the magic bullet theory to reconcile conflicting evidence. The Commission embraced it, despite its impossibility. This single bullet supposedly entered Kennedy's back, exited his throat, entered Connolly's back, exited Connolly's chest, shattered Connolly's wrist, and lodged in Connolly's thigh. It emerged in pristine condition, showing no deformation despite passing through bone multiple times. Ballistics experts testified this was impossible. The Commission ignored them. Then there's the physical evidence from Dealey Plaza. Witnesses reported between 3 and 8 shots fired, far more than Oswald could have fired from his bolt-action rifle in the time available. Acoustical analysis conducted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 confirmed at least 4 shots, proving multiple shooters. The Warren Commission claimed 3 shots total, all from Oswald's rifle. They never explained how Oswald fired, aimed, and reloaded fast enough to hit a moving target twice in under 6 seconds. Expert marksmen attempting to recreate the feat failed consistently. Multiple witnesses saw suspicious activity that suggested conspiracy. Lee Bowers, working in a railroad tower overlooking the grassy knoll, observed 2 men behind the fence minutes before the shooting. Julia Ann Mercer saw a truck parked near Dealey Plaza with a man removing a rifle case. She identified Jack Ruby as the driver. Her testimony was altered in Warren Commission records. Numerous Dealey Plaza witnesses reported smelling gunpowder and hearing shots from the grassy knoll. The Commission dismissed all of them, claiming acoustic confusion. The Commission never seriously investigated Oswald's connections to intelligence agencies. Oswald had been a Marine stationed at Atsugi Naval Air Station in Japan, where the CIA operated U-2 planes. He defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, threatened to reveal classified radar information, then returned to the United States in 1962 without prosecution. The State Department had paid for his return trip. He'd been in contact with Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City weeks before the assassination. He'd worked in a building along the motorcade route, secured by employment arranged through CIA-connected individuals. These connections suggested Oswald was exactly what he claimed, a patsy set up to take the fall for an operation involving intelligence assets. Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald eliminated the only person who could confirm or deny this. Ruby himself had mafia connections dating to the 1940s. He'd worked for Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, the same Giancana whom the CIA hired for attempts to assassinate Castro. Ruby told the Warren Commission he killed Oswald to spare Jackie Kennedy the trauma of a trial. This made no sense. Ruby had no relationship with the Kennedys. His real motive became clear in later testimony. Everything pertaining to what has happened has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts. If you want to know my motive, I'll tell you why I did it. I wanted to be a big hero, and I wanted to show Jackie what a tough guy I was. Ruby died of cancer in 1967, conveniently before he could testify in a new trial. His lawyer claimed Ruby was silenced, saying, "Ruby told me they're going to find me dead in here." And they did. Multiple witnesses reported Ruby received injections during his imprisonment, developing aggressive cancer within months, despite no prior diagnosis. His death followed the pattern of other witnesses who threatened to expose the conspiracy. The commission never investigated Kennedy's monetary policy as a possible motive. They never examined Federal Reserve interests or banking connections to the assassination. They never questioned why Kennedy's planned Dallas speech about dark forces disappeared. They never explored defense contractor opposition to Vietnam withdrawal. They operated under the assumption that only personal or ideological motives mattered, ignoring the billions of dollars at stake in Kennedy's policy decisions. In September 1964, the Warren Commission published its report, concluding that Oswald acted alone for unclear reasons, motivated by vague resentment of authority. The evidence was overwhelming that this conclusion was false. The commission knew it was false. They published it anyway because their job wasn't finding truth, it was protecting institutions. 50 years later, the secrecy continues. In 2017, President Trump promised to release all remaining classified documents related to Kennedy's assassination. The deadline arrived. The CIA and FBI claimed national security required continued secrecy. Trump released some documents, but withheld thousands more. In 2021, President Biden extended the secrecy until 2022, then extended it again until 2023. As of 2026, critical documents remain sealed. 63 years after Kennedy's death, government still claims that truth threatens national security. The question is obvious. What information, 6 decades old, still requires secrecy? The answer is equally obvious. Information that would confirm what everyone suspects, that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy involving elements of U.S. intelligence, organized crime, and banking interests working together to eliminate a president who threatened their power. The Warren Commission didn't fail to find this evidence. It succeeded in hiding it. The most revealing aspect of Kennedy's assassination isn't what happened that day in Dallas. It's what happened to monetary policy immediately afterward. Within weeks, every financial initiative Kennedy championed was quietly reversed or abandoned. The speed and completeness of this reversal suggests planning that predated his death. Executive Order 11,110 was never repealed. It remains on the books, technically enforceable today. But the Treasury stopped issuing silver certificates immediately after Kennedy's death. The $421 million already in circulation stayed there, but no additional certificates were printed. The $3.9 billion authorization Kennedy had planned to issue by 1964 simply never materialized. When asked about this in 1964, Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon, who served under Kennedy and stayed under Johnson's, stated only that the program has been suspended pending further review. No further review ever occurred. By 1968, the Treasury actively removed silver certificates from circulation. The Coinage Act of 1965 eliminated silver from dimes and quarters. The Act of 1968 ended silver certificate redemption for physical silver. Citizens holding the red seal notes Kennedy issued could still use them as currency, but they could no longer exchange them for precious metal. The certificates became indistinguishable from Federal Reserve notes. In practical terms, both were fiat currency backed by nothing, controlled by the banking system. The transition from Kennedy's policy to Johnson's was mathematically stark. In 1963, under Kennedy, the national debt stood at $305 billion. The government's annual interest payment on this debt was $9 billion. By 1968, after 5 years of Johnson's policies, the debt had grown to $347 billion, with annual interest exceeding $12 billion. This wasn't accidental or inevitable. This was policy choice. Johnson chose to finance both the Great Society domestic programs and the Vietnam War through deficit spending, borrowing from the Federal Reserve rather than raising taxes or printing treasury notes. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Johnson would propose massive spending programs: Medicaid, urban renewal, education, funding, war escalation. Congress would authorize the spending. The Treasury would issue bonds to cover the cost. The Federal Reserve would purchase these bonds with money created from nothing. The government would pay interest on these bonds forever. The Federal Reserve member banks would collect that interest, distributing it to shareholders as dividends. The banks made profit on every dollar government spent. The more government spent, the more profit banks made. Kennedy's silver certificates would have short-circuited this entire mechanism. Treasury could issue money directly. Government spending wouldn't require borrowing. No borrowing meant no bonds, no interest, no profit for banks. Johnson's restoration of Federal Reserve monopoly was unjust policy preference. It was the explicit purpose of his presidency. Whether Johnson knew this before Kennedy's death or learned it immediately after, the result was identical. He served the banking system perfectly. The architects of this system made their satisfaction known. As Federal Reserve Chairman William McChesney Martin, appointed by Truman and reappointed by Kennedy, had feuded with Kennedy over monetary policy. Kennedy wanted to keep interest rates low and expand the money supply to stimulate growth. Martin wanted to contract money supply to prevent inflation, even if it slowed the economy. After Kennedy's death, Martin publicly praised Johnson's sound economic stewardship and was reappointed for another term. The conflict disappeared. Banking industry publications were even more explicit. The American Bankers Association Journal published an editorial in 1964 titled "A Return to Sound Policy," praising the end of experimental monetary programs and the restoration of professional management of the money supply. The editorial never mentioned Kennedy by name, but the timing was obvious. The experiment they criticized was silver certificates. The sound policy they praised was Federal Reserve control. Their satisfaction with Kennedy's death was barely concealed. The broader economic impact took years to manifest, but was devastating. From 1965 to 1980, the U.S. experienced stagflation, simultaneous high inflation, and economic stagnation. This occurred because Johnson and subsequent presidents financed spending through money creation rather than taxation. The Federal Reserve expanded money supply by 500% during this period, destroying the dollar's purchasing power. A dollar in 1963 could buy what $9.43 buys in 2024. This was inevitable. Inflation, this was systematic currency debasement, transferring wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to banks. Nixon's decision in 1971 to end dollar-gold convertibility completed the transition to pure fiat currency. From 1944 to 1971, under the Bretton Woods system, dollars were convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This limited money creation. The Fed couldn't create more dollars than gold reserves could support. By the late 1960s, deficit spending under Johnson had created more dollars than gold could back. Foreign governments began demanding gold instead of dollars. U.S. gold reserves declined from 20,000 tons in 1960 to 8,100 tons in 1971. Nixon faced a choice: stop deficit spending or end gold convertibility. He chose to end gold backing. This decision was presented as necessary to prevent economic crisis. The truth was simpler. Ending gold backing removed all constraints on money creation. The Federal Reserve could now create infinite money, financing infinite government spending, generating infinite debt, and infinite interest payments. The system Kennedy challenged had evolved to invulnerability. Without gold, backing, or silver certificates, nothing constrained the Fed's power. The mathematical result was exponential debt growth. In 1971, national debt stood at $398 billion. By 2024, it exceeds $34 trillion, 8,500% increase. The interest payment on this debt now exceeds $640 billion annually, more than the entire defense budget. Every cent of this interest flows to Federal Reserve member banks and bondholders. The banks that killed Kennedy's monetary reform have collected trillions in interest over 60 years. The profit from his assassination is incalculable. Modern economists treat this system as inevitable, as though debt-based currency is the only possible model. They teach students that central banking is scientific necessity, that inflation is a natural phenomenon, that government must borrow to spend. None of this is true. These are ideological claims designed to protect banker profits, the alternative government issuing its own currency, backed by precious metals or productive capacity. Without borrowing from private banks worked perfectly well for most of American history. Lincoln proved it with greenbacks. Kennedy proved it with silver certificates. Both were killed. The lesson was clear. By 1970, no one in government even discussed alternatives to Federal Reserve control. The conversation had shifted from whether central banking was good to how the Fed should manage the economy. The fundamental question, why should private banks control public money, supply disappeared from acceptable political discourse. Kennedy's challenge to this system became unthinkable, then forgotten. His executive order 11,110 remained on the books, legally enforceable, technically allowing Treasury to issue silver certificates today. But no president has invoked it. No Treasury Secretary has suggested using it. The order exists as a historical curiosity, a reminder of what might have been. The clearest evidence that Kennedy's monetary policy motivated his assassination is what happened to that policy immediately after his death. If he'd been killed by a lone gunman with no connection to banking interests, his silver certificate program would have continued. Johnson would have no reason to cancel it. But the program died the moment Kennedy did, reversed with suspicious speed and finality. This isn't proof of conspiracy, but it's exactly what you'd expect if the conspiracy existed. Follow the money. Kennedy threatened to eliminate billions in annual interest payments. He died. The interest payments continued. The banks profited. The debt grew. The system survived. In the cold mathematics of motive, means, and opportunity, the Federal Reserve had all three. Here's what nobody wants you to understand. Kennedy's assassination wasn't unique. Kate was the latest iteration of a pattern that's been playing out for centuries. Kate leaders who challenge banking control of currency don't complete their terms. Coup, character, destruction, coup, character destruction, economic sabotage. But the result is constant. The banks win. The leader is removed. The monetary system continues unchanged. We've already covered Jackson and Lincoln, but the pattern extends globally. In 1881, Russian Tsar Alexander II began planning to issue state currency, bypassing Rothschild banking control. He was assassinated by a bomb on March 13, 1881. His successor, Alexander III, immediately abandoned monetary reform and borrowed heavily from European banks. In 1914, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand planned to implement a national banking system independent of banking dynasties financing both Austria and Germany. He was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggering World War I. That war generated more debt and more bank profit than any conflict in history. The pattern intensified after World War II. In 1958, French President Charles de Gaulle began converting France's dollar reserves to gold, challenging dollar dominance and Federal Reserve control of international currency. He survived assassination attempts in 1961 and 1962, both linked to banking interests furious at his monetary policy. He was forced from office in 1969 after massive protests and economic sabotage. In 1963, Indonesian President Sukarno introduced the confrontancy economic policy, nationalizing banks and creating state-controlled currency. The CIA backed a military coup in 1965 that overthrew Sukarno and killed an estimated 500,000 Indonesians. A new regime immediately restored private banking and borrowed heavily from Western banks. The most blatant example came in 2011. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi announced plans to introduce the gold dinar, a currency backed by Libya's 144 tons of gold, to replace the dollar in African oil trade. Libya had no debt and held billions in foreign reserves. Gaddafi's plan would have established an independent African currency bloc, destroying Western banking control of African economies. Within months, NATO intervened in Libya's civil war, bombing Gaddafi's forces and supporting rebels. On October 20, 2011, rebels captured and killed Gaddafi. The gold dinar died with him. Libya descended into chaos. Its gold reserves disappeared. Western banks moved in to finance reconstruction. The pattern repeated perfectly. The U.S. domestic version of this pattern operated through quieter means after Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy, running for president in 1968 on a platform nearly identical to his brother's, including monetary reform, was assassinated in June 1968, moments after winning the California primary. The official story blamed Sirhan, a Palestinian upset about RFK's support for Israel. But Sirhan was standing in front of Kennedy, while autopsies showed Kennedy was shot from behind at point-blank range. Multiple witnesses reported seeing security guard Thane Eugene Caesar behind Kennedy, gun drawn. Caesar worked for a company with CIA connections. He was never seriously investigated. K's death eliminated the Kennedy dynasty's challenge to the system. Later, presidential candidates learned subtler lessons. George McGovern, running in 1972 on an anti-war platform that would have reduced defense spending and debt, was destroyed through character assassination, the Eagleton affair, and fabricated corruption allegations. Jimmy Carter, who criticized Federal Reserve policy and appointed Paul Volcker to reform the system, watched Volcker instead raise interest rates to 20%, crushing the economy and ensuring Carter's 1980 defeat. The lesson: even appointing reformers backfires when those reformers protect the system. The post-Kennedy presidents understood this implicitly. Gerald Ford had been on the Warren Commission and knew exactly what happened to presidents who challenged banking interests. He served the system faithfully. Ronald Reagan, shot in 1981 by John Hinckley Jr., survived his assassination attempt and immediately moderated his criticism of the Federal Reserve. George H.W. Bush, former CIA director, understood the intelligence banking nexus intimately and never questioned it. Bill Clinton balanced the budget but repealed Glass-Steagall, allowing banks to consolidate further. George W. Bush exploded deficits through wars and Medicare expansion, all financed through Fed borrowing. Barack Obama bailed out banks with trillions. Donald Trump added $8 trillion in 4 years. Joe Biden continued the pattern. Not one challenged Federal Reserve control. Not one suggested returning to gold backing or Treasury-issued currency. They learned, but the mechanism of control evolved from physical assassination to systemic capture. Modern presidents don't need to be killed, they're captured before they take office. Campaign finance ensures only candidates acceptable to banking interests receive funding. Media control ensures only approved narratives reach voters. Think tanks and universities, funded by banking foundations, train economists who teach that central banking is scientific necessity. By the time someone becomes president, they've been screened, funded, and educated by the system they might otherwise challenge. Assassination becomes unnecessary because the filtering process is so effective. But the threat of assassination never disappears entirely. It serves as ultimate deterrent, the nuclear option that reminds would-be reformers what happens to those who push too hard. Kennedy's murder established this deterrent for the television age. Every president since has understood, on some level, that the same forces capable of killing a president in broad daylight in Dallas remain capable of doing it again. Consider the evidence of systemic control. Every Federal Reserve chairman since 1963 has been approved by banking interests before nomination. Paul Volcker, appointed by Carter, had been Rockefeller's advisor. Alan Greenspan had been a consultant for J.P. Morgan. Ben Bernanke served on the Council on Foreign Relations, funded by banking families. Janet Yellen worked for the Brookings Institution, funded by the same sources. Jerome Powell was a partner at Carlyle Group, a private equity firm with deep banking connections. The continuity of policy across different chairmen, different presidents, different parties reveals that the real power resides with the permanent banking interests these chairmen serve. The mathematical proof lies in debt growth. Regardless of which party controls Congress or the presidency, national debt grows exponentially. Republicans promise fiscal responsibility, then explode spending through military expansion. Democrats promise social programs, then finance them through deficit spending. Both parties serve the debt system because both parties are funded by banks that profit from debt. The occasional balanced budget achieved only 3 times since 1963, in 1998-2000 under Clinton, proves the exception. The rule is perpetual debt expansion, perpetual interest payments, perpetual bank profit. Modern financial crises followed the same pattern Kennedy recognized. The 2008 crisis occurred because Federal Reserve's policy keeping interest rates at 1% from 2003 to 2005 inflated a housing bubble that inevitably burst. When banks faced collapse from their own recklessness, the Fed created $4.5 trillion to bail them out. The banks survived. The executives kept their positions and bonuses. Millions of Americans lost homes and savings. The pattern repeated exactly. Privatize profit, socialize loss. The system transfers wealth from public to banks, generation after generation, and kills anyone who threatens to end the transfer. Kennedy understood this in 1963. He tried to break the cycle with silver certificates. He died. The cycle continued. Today, the national debt exceeds $34 trillion. Annual interest payments exceed $640 billion. The Federal Reserve continues creating money from nothing, financing unlimited government spending, collecting interest on every dollar. The banks that killed Kennedy's reform have collected trillions in profit over 6 decades. The assassination was the most profitable murder in human history, generating returns that compound annually forever. The most dangerous truth about Kennedy's assassination isn't that it happened. It's that the system that killed him operates more powerfully today than in 1963, and every mechanism he challenged has expanded beyond his darkest predictions. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet in 1963 was $36 billion. Today, it exceeds $7 trillion. The national debt was $305 billion then. Today, it's $34 trillion. The annual interest payment was $9 billion. Today, it's $640 billion. The banking system Kennedy fought to restrain now controls more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans combined. Here's what they do, unteach in economics classes. The Federal Reserve is unstruggling to control inflation or manage the economy. It's perfectly achieving its designed purpose, transferring wealth from the productive economy to the financial sector. Every boom-bust cycle accomplishes this transfer. During booms, cheap Fed credit inflates asset prices. Insiders buy assets with borrowed money. During busts, the Fed raises rates, collapsing asset prices. Insiders buy distressed assets for pennies. A cycle repeats. Each iteration consolidates wealth upward. The COVID-19 pandemic provided the starkest example. In March 2020, the Fed created $3 trillion in 6 months, more than any period in history. This money didn't go to unemployed workers or failing small businesses. It went to banks, corporations, and asset markets. Stock market recovered to all-time highs, while 40 million Americans filed unemployment claims. Billionaire wealth increased by $1.8 trillion during the pandemic. Worker wealth declined. The Fed facilitated the largest upward wealth transfer in American history, and they called it economic stimulus. Kennedy would have recognized this immediately as the wealth extraction mechanism he tried to stop. The difference is scale. In 1963, the Fed could create tens of billions. Today, trillions. The power has expanded proportionally, so has the impossibility of challenging it. Modern presidents don't even try. When Donald Trump criticized the Fed during his 2016 campaign, claiming it was keeping rates low to help Obama, he seemed to promise reform. Once in office, Trump appointed Fed Chair Jerome Powell, praised low rates when they served his interest, and added $8 trillion to the national debt. He learned the same lesson every president learns: the Fed is untouchable, and debt expansion is mandatory. Trump's populist rhetoric evaporated the moment he took office because the system captures everyone who enters it. The same pattern plays out globally. Any nation attempting monetary independence faces immediate consequences. Venezuela tried to sell oil for currency other than dollars. Regime change operations began. Iran tried to establish non-dollar oil trade sanctions and assassination of key officials. Russia tried to reduce dollar dependence, frozen assets, and financial warfare. China is currently trying to establish the yuan as a reserve currency, escalating tensions and trade wars. The pattern is always the same. Challenge dollar hegemony in the Federal Reserve System, backing it, face destruction. The enforcement mechanism has evolved from bullets to bytes. Modern assassination doesn't require Dealey Plaza. It requires central bank digital currencies, surveillance capitalism, and financial deplatforming. Dissidents don't get shot, they get their bank accounts frozen. Opposition leaders don't get killed, they get their funding sources eliminated. The system has learned that control is more sustainable than violence. But violence remains available for those who push too hard. The most chilling aspect is how thoroughly the alternative has been erased from public consciousness. Most Americans under 50 have never heard of silver certificates. They don't know Executive Order 11,110 exists. They've never questioned why government borrows money instead of creating it. They accept debt-based currency as natural law rather than designed system. This is the ultimate success of Kennedy's assassination, not just killing the man, but killing the idea that alternatives exist. Economics departments and major universities won't touch this subject. Professors who question Federal Reserve policy find themselves denied tenure. Students who research monetary alternatives are guided towards safer topics. The entire academic apparatus exists to legitimize central banking and delegitimize alternatives. This isn't conspiracy, it's institutional capture. Banks fund economics departments through endowments and grants. Those departments produce economists who justify bank power. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Media coverage follows the same pattern. Mainstream outlets treat the Federal Reserve as apolitical, technocratic, and necessary. They interview Fed officials as objective experts rather than private bank representatives. They never ask why a private banking cartel controls public money supply. They never compare America's debt-based system to historical alternatives. They never mention that the Constitution grants Congress, not private banks, authority to coin money. These questions are beyond acceptable discourse. The result is a population that accepts banker control as inevitable while drowning in debt they do understand. Student loan debt exceeds $1.7 trillion. Credit card debt exceeds $1 trillion. Mortgage debt exceeds $11 trillion. Auto loan debt exceeds $1.5 trillion. This debt generates interest income for banks, enslaving borrowers to monthly payments that sustain bank profit. The system that killed Kennedy has trapped Americans in debt peonage that would have appalled the founders. Here, as the darkest truth, Kennedy's assassination worked so well that it has been standardized as a template. Challenge banking control. Face elimination. The method varies: character assassination for minor threats, economic sabotage for moderate threats, physical assassination for existential threats. But the principle is constant. The system protects itself ruthlessly and effectively. Kennedy learned this in Dallas. His example teaches every subsequent leader to stay within boundaries or face consequences. Yet the system contains its own destruction. Debt-based currency is mathematically unsustainable. Total debt must grow exponentially forever, or the system collapses. Growth requires resources, population, energy, materials. These are finite. Eventually, physical limits constrain debt expansion. At that point, the system faces crisis. This explains increasing financial instability. 2008, 2020, the recurring near collapses that require ever larger Fed interventions. Each crisis requires more money creation, causing more inflation, requiring more rate hikes, causing more crisis. The cycle accelerates. Kennedy understood this in 1963. He saw that debt-based currency would eventually destroy the dollar and the economy with it. His silver certificates were an attempt to establish an alternative before the inevitable crash. He was killed before he could complete this work, but the mathematics he recognized remained. The debt grows, the interest compounds. The day of reckoning approaches. When that day comes, when the debt becomes unpayable, when inflation destroys the dollar's value, when the system finally collapses, sits Kennedy's executive order. 11,110 will still be on the books. Some future president, desperate for solutions during economic catastrophe, might rediscover it. They might realize that government can issue money without borrowing from private banks. They might understand that Kennedy died trying to implement this, and that his death teaches exactly how dangerous banking interests consider this threat. That future president will face the same choice Kennedy faced: accept the system and watch America decline, or challenge the system and risk everything. History suggests what happens to those who choose the latter. But history also suggests that eventually someone will have to choose. The system can't sustain itself forever. The mathematics don't work. The debt grows faster than the economy. The interest compounds faster than income increases. Something has to give. When it gives, the truth about Kennedy's assassination might finally matter. Not as historical curiosity, but as practical guide. Because whoever tries to rebuild the monetary system will need to understand why Kennedy failed. They'll need to understand that banking interests will fight to the death to prevent reform. They'll need to understand that silver certificates, or their equivalent, represent an existential threat to the most powerful financial cartel in history. They'll need to understand that the shots fired in Dealey Plaza weren't just about killing one man. They were about killing the idea that government can serve the people instead of the banks. This is what they don't want you to know. Not that Kennedy was killed by conspiracy. Most Americans already suspect that. But that the conspiracy succeeded completely. That the system it protected has become more powerful and more parasitic. That it will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. And that when it does, we'll need exactly the kind of monetary reform Kennedy died attempting to implement. They don't want you to know that Kennedy's fight wasn't finished in Dallas. It was postponed. And one day, someone will have to finish it. On November 22nd, 1963, 3 bullets killed a president. But the real assassination happened in the seconds after those bullets struck. When the last American president, willing to challenge Federal Reserve control, bled out in Parkland Hospital. What died in Dallas wasn't just John F. Kennedy. It was the possibility that American presidents could serve the people instead of the banks. The mathematical proof is undeniable. Kennedy challenged the Federal Reserve with Executive Order 11,110, issuing silver certificates to bypass debt-based currency. He planned to expand this program, eliminating billions in annual interest payments to private banks. He pursued peace policies that would have reduced military spending and the debt financing it. He threatened every revenue stream that made the Federal Reserve and its member banks the most profitable institutions in history. 5 months after signing the order, he was dead. His policies died with him. The banks survived. The debt grew. The interest payments multiplied. The system continued unchanged for 6 decades. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history, visible in Treasury records, Federal Reserve publications, and the systematic policy reversals that occurred immediately after Kennedy's assassination. The Warren Commission's failure to investigate monetary policy as motive wasn't oversight tight, was design. Men like Allen Dulles and John McCloy, with lifelong connections to banking interests, ensured that certain questions were never asked. The classified documents that remained sealed 63 years later don't hide the identity of a second shooter. They hide the identity of who gave the order and why. The pattern that killed Kennedy didn't end with him. It's a permanent feature of a system where private banks control public money supply. Leaders who challenge this control face elimination through assassination, coup, economic sabotage, or character destruction. The method varies with circumstances, but the result is constant. The banking system survives. The challenger doesn't. Robert Kennedy learned this in 1968. Gaddafi learned it in 2011. Every president since has learned to stay within boundaries or face consequences. But the system contains its own destruction. Debt-based currency requires exponential debt growth forever. This is mathematically impossible in a finite world. The national debt now exceeds $34 trillion, growing faster than the economy that must service it. Interest payments exceed $640 billion annually, consuming resources that could feed, house, and educate millions. The Federal Reserve responds to each crisis by creating more money, causing more inflation, requiring more rate increases, causing more crisis. The cycle accelerates toward inevitable collapse. When that collapse comes, not if, when Kennedy's executive order 11,110 will still be there. Legally enforceable, technically allowing Treasury to issue currency without Federal Reserve involvement. Some desperate future president might rediscover it. They'll face the same choice Kennedy faced: accept banker control and watch America decline. Challenge the system and risk everything. History teaches what happens to those who choose challenge. But history also teaches that sometimes challenge becomes necessary regardless of cost. The real conspiracy isn't that Kennedy was killed by multiple shooters or intelligence operatives or mafia hitmen. The real conspiracy is that we've rebuilt an entire economic system on the principle that private banks should profit from creating public money, and that this system will murder presidents to protect that profit. The real conspiracy is that 63 years later, we still accept this as normal. We still teach it in schools as inevitable, still elect presidents who serve the banks rather than the people. Kennedy understood something that every American should understand. The Constitution grants Congress, not private banks, the authority to coin money and regulate its value. This isn't radical theory. It's Article 1, Section 8. The Federal Reserve is constitutional only if you believe that Congress can delegate its monetary authority to a private banking cartel, collect interest on money created from nothing, and operate without meaningful public oversight. Kennedy believed this delegation was unconstitutional and economically catastrophic. He tried to reclaim congressional monetary authority through silver certificates. He died for it. The question facing Americans today is whether Kennedy was right. Is the Federal Reserve System, private banks, creating money as debt, charging interest on that creation, and profiting from perpetual debt expansion serving the public interest? Or is it the most sophisticated wealth extraction scheme in history, transferring trillions from productive economy to financial sector through inflation, debt, and boom-bust cycles? The evidence is overwhelming. Since 1963, the rich have gotten exponentially richer. The middle class has stagnated, and national debt has grown 100-fold. This isn't natural economic evolution. This is designed extraction. Kennedy tried to stop it. The silver certificates he issued in 1963 were an unsymbolic gesture. They were a declaration of war against the most powerful financial cartel in history. They were proof that alternatives exist, that government can create money without debt, that banker control is choice rather than necessity. The bullets that killed Kennedy killed this proof. The Warren Commission buried it. Commissions hid it. The economic orthodoxy erased it from memory. But the evidence remains, carved in Federal Register entries and Treasury archives, visible to anyone willing to look. Executive Order 11,110 exists. Silver certificates circulated. Kennedy challenged the Fed. Kennedy died. The Fed survived. The connection is too obvious to miss and too dangerous to acknowledge. This is why they don't want you to know what really happened on November 22nd, 1963. Not because the truth reveals who shot Kennedy from where, that's irrelevant detail, but because the truth reveals why Kennedy had to die, and that reason remains as powerful today as it was then. As long as private banks control the money supply, presidents who challenge that control will face removal. The system protects itself ruthlessly and effectively. Kennedy's assassination proves this. His executive order, abandoned but never repealed, remains as evidence of what happens to presidents who forget their place in the hierarchy. The shots fired in Dealey Plaza echo through 6 decades of American history. They taught every subsequent president the boundaries of acceptable policy. They established that monetary reform is fatal, that banking interests are untouchable, that debt expansion is mandatory. They created the world we live in now, where $34 trillion in debt enslaves future generations, where banks collect hundreds of billions in annual interest, where financial crises transfer wealth upward with mathematical precision. Kennedy saw this future in 1963. He tried to prevent it. He died trying. We live with the consequences of his failure. The question is whether we'll continue accepting those consequences, or whether someday, somehow, another leader will find the courage to finish what Kennedy started. History suggests that leader will face the same fate Kennedy faced. But history also suggests that eventually the system will collapse from its own contradictions, and at that moment will desperately need leaders willing to risk everything to rebuild it. The silver certificates are gone now, replaced by Federal Reserve notes worth less each year. But Executive Order 11,110 remains, a ghost of what might have been, a reminder that alternatives exist. Kennedy proved that government can create money without debt. He proved that banker control isn't inevitable. He proved that the Constitution means what it says. He paid for these proofs with his life. The only question left is whether his death will remain the last word on American monetary policy, or whether one day someone would dare to say what Kennedy said, that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional, that debt-based currency is slavery, that the American people deserve money created for their benefit rather than banker profit. That person will need to understand what happened in Dallas. They'll need to understand that challenging the Fed isn't political position, it's declaration of war. They'll need to understand that history is watching, that the stakes are absolute, and that the price of failure is measured in bullets and blood. John F. Kennedy understood all of this. He challenged the system anyway. For that, he died. The system survived, And every day that system survives, Kennedy's assassination proves its worth to those who ordered it. The most profitable murder in history, paying dividends for 63 years and counting.